watching the recording. Thanks for joining our vSurround Hangout on whether serverless architectures are ready for prime time. I've got with me today Adam Johnson from IOpipe, David Wells from the Serverless Framework, and Ryan Scott Brown from Red Hat. And my name is Daniel Krook. I'll be your host. I am a senior software engineer at IBM. I work as an end user, a developer of IBM Cloud Services, open source services like OpenStack, Cloud Foundry, Docker, and most recently OpenWhisk for serverless applications. Basically help customers learn about them and use them and see what's going on in the industry. So how about we start with Adam? Why don't you give your intro?
Hi, I'm Adam Johnson. I'm co-founder and CEO of IOpipe. And at IOpipe, we're providing application performance monitoring for serverless applications running on services like Amazon Lambda.
Okay, how about you, David?
Yeah, I'm David Wells. I work at Serverless Inc. We put out the Serverless framework. I do a lot of stuff here. I joined as the developer evangelist, so it's kind of teaching people about the serverless world. But I'm also like building some internal products here as well. But yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Awesome. Ryan?
Yeah, I'm Ryan Brown, and I work at Red Hat. I work on the Ansible project, which is orchestration framework, and the part that I work on is cloud modules, so integrating with all these new kind of function as a service and serverless architectures in Ansible, as well as all the existing cloud services. And I also run a blog, serverlesscode.com, which is about kind of all this stuff.
Awesome. All right, so let's set up with our first section, which is a couple questions around what does serverless mean to you? There's various definitions that have been out there, still trying to capture what exactly this new paradigm is. What's your take?
Yeah, should we like go around and say our thoughts on it?
All right, why not? Start. Go ahead.
All right, cool. So yeah, to me, serverless is like about auto scaling, event driven architectures that where you never pay for idle boxes. The system is like implicitly fault tolerant, and the functions are the unit of deployment. So instead of deploying an entire application, you're deploying things at the function level. And then there's also kind of this notion in my mind of offloading things that aren't your business's core competencies to third parties, third-party services like maybe Auth to Auth0 or search to something like Algolia. So where you can kind of focus on your application business logic instead of all the kind of glue pieces. That's in my mind what it is.
Awesome.
Yeah, I have a really close definition to that. It's a lot of outsourcing to other services for different parts of your application, but also for having the ability to automate your infrastructure well. And I don't think that the function has to be the unit of deployment, but whatever you deploy has to be able to be something that you can automate and repeat. And the key is management. So how easy is it for you to manage whatever services that you're receiving? And how easy is it for you to trace down from an idea that you have to this is the set of services that I need and get a prototype out that actually works on those services, as opposed to, if you're writing your own web application, you have a bunch of scaffolding that you have to write first that you then can deploy onto a server or a group of servers behind a load balancer and then make that available. So it's kind of a time to market thing.
And mine's a little similar, but generally to kind of summarize up, I think serverless is an overarching term that combines both function as a service, which could be like an Amazon Lambda in a public cloud service, but it could also be you could also run it in a on-prem. There's maybe not a lot of use cases of that yet, but I think that'll start emerging. In that case, you may not get the kind of economic value, but there may be other value propositions for users of that. So in addition to using function as a service, part of serverless is also using backend as a service. So if you combine those two things together, essentially, the developers should not have to care about the servers. Someone is caring about the servers, whether that's the public cloud service provider, or if you're using like an Auth0, for example, for authentication service, or if your ops team is running it in their own data center. I think all of these use cases can still be considered serverless, so long as the developer is not having to worry about the operating system underneath, and they just push code.
Yeah. Building on that, Adam, I definitely think the biggest thing about the term serverless, I think, is that it's a point of view. And it's not necessarily right that the servers go away. You still have a whole bunch of services and things that you depend on outside of the developer point of view. And, where the concerns of building, packaging, deploying are no longer the primary concerns, where there's a pure focus on the code itself. I think that's the most important part. And I wouldn't tie it to a technology either, be it the serverless framework, be it a platform like Lambda or OpenWhisk. Really, I see, there's a lot of struggle of how do you differentiate it from platform as a service. And in fact, you can almost call it bash scripting for the cloud, right? You're writing a script, it's deployed somewhere, it's going to run, but you're not quite concerned about that. So I think, as an overall umbrella term, it's a little bit confusing, but as long as you focus, not that there isn't servers, but that there's a point of view of the developer, that I'm more closely focused on my code rather than where it's run or how it gets there.
Well, if you look at platform as a service, a lot of the same things that, if you were to turn back to, 2010, promises that you got from places like Heroku and other platform as a service, didn't always come true because the abstraction wasn't quite right, I think, because you had an abstraction in platform as a service where you're getting a slice of a machine, which under the hood was containers in a lot of cases. But it didn't map to how developers actually wanted to think about things, because they still had to write like a WSGI application or a Rails application, rather than writing very smaller focused code that doesn't necessarily hook up, or doesn't necessarily have to hook up to an HTTP endpoint, but can hook up to some other kind of event source.
Right. And with that kind of setup as well, like if you want to break things out into kind of a microservices setup, you have to spin up all these individual boxes where they might not be doing that much. But if you want to separate those concerns, those costs start stacking up when you're running all these boxes that, this one might only be running 10 times a month. But if you want to keep those things clean and isolated, that was one of the issues that I was seeing, personally at least.
So you'd have a minimum size of a service would be 2 boxes to be redundant, and then people would deploy those for low traffic things. Is that what you mean?
More like, so if I wanted to separate out like the business logic of like, okay, I have a mailer service, I have maybe my user auth over here, like instead of packaging things into one like monolithic application and deploying that up to a platform as a service, I could break things out into exactly what they do, and put them, basically splitting things out and putting those on boxes where they're just running. Some of the services might not be getting as much usage as the others, whereas they might be sitting idly. Whereas this new kind of paradigm, you have the code just sits there until it's called, which was like a mind-blowing thing when I first heard about it.
Yeah, I think that's pretty important too when you start scaling microservices, right? So it sounds great, you package an application in a container, but then you have to create another container as well to make it HA. Then you might have to handle and deploy it in different regions. So before you know it, your single monolith, now you've broken it down into more efficient units, but now you have tons of units to handle, right? So you actually have to deploy all those different things. And I think serverless actually abstracts a lot of that, so you get the benefits of what containerization does for code isolation, but also you get that automated scale, but also the automated deployment when needed anywhere you happen to have it deployed.
Yeah, and like OpenWhisk is obviously an open platform, and you can see that it's just all Docker under the hood. There's nothing incredibly special about how it's running your code.
Yeah, I think the other kind of important difference between platform as a service and serverless is really that serverless is very well, it's very easy to adopt serverless in small chunks, right? You can start offloading parts of your application to serverless very, very easily and keep your legacy application going and slowly move parts of that over. Whereas I think in platform as a service, it was a very constrictive and kind of hard to find rules as to how you have to do things. And it wasn't really well suited for breaking things into smaller pieces. So for that, I think it was just harder to adopt because you had to build your application with it in mind from the very beginning. Whereas with serverless, you don't necessarily have to do that.
Right. Yeah, that's the beauty of it. You can kind of adopt it piecemeal. And it's not, you know, do small things first, and then you can start growing that out. It's pretty,
Awesome. I've got some more thoughts on that for later in the session. So, but let's move on to the next question, right? So, does it really matter that, you know, we have an official name? I know, for example, David, we've got the serverless framework to kind of set the name serverless out there. Is there something that a better name for this? Is there someone who should be really defining what that is? I guess from my point of view is it's, as long as it's interoperable, that's when you need a name. You need to have something that's kind of the common denominator that you can move from maybe on-prem to cloud across different providers. But does it matter right now that there's still so much confusion?
Yeah, so the term serverless, it actually predates the framework that Austin built. The framework used to be called JAWS. And if you look at, have you guys seen the Martin Fowler serverless article?
Yep.
Yeah. So there's a section in there of like the history of where the term came from. I can't remember exactly who coined it. I think someone at Iron.io or something.
Yeah, it was Iron.io originally.
Okay.
Yeah, it's. I mean, there's tweets all the time about this. You know, I thought it was the name. The name to me isn't super like critical. There was a really cool tweet or a post by Algolia recently. They went to the Serverless Conf in London, and they were saying like, okay, at Serverless Conf in London, there's a room called Jeff, because there's this like internal industry joke of like, what should we call serverless? We could call it anything. How about we call it Jeff? There's a post about that. So they dedicated a room in the conference and named it the Jeff Room or whatever, just to remind people like, let's not like bike shed on like names. Let's like make things move forward. You know, like I thought that was beautiful. But
so Jeff is a pretty great joke. I'm a fan of that. But when you get into a conversation with people, well, you know, it might start with something serverless, but usually you have to get more specific. So serverless is kind of a basket containing all of these other concepts like event-driven programming that doesn't really have to be serverless, because you can do that in something like Akka, or function as a service, which you could run your own function as a service and you're doing the operation. So it's not really, no ops or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And so serverless serves as kind of a basket for all of these things. And when people talk about specific things, they'll use the terms for that other stuff. It's confusing, and it's hard for newcomers when they come in, because they'll hear serverless and think serverless framework, which is not really true. So if you guys want to rename, I have some ideas for you.
Yeah, I'll run that by Austin. I don't know if he'll like that.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I think like maybe I think in general, like it's not a big deal talking about the terminology. I just hope that we don't spend years, you know, asking what is serverless like we did with cloud back in the day. But I think I agree. In general, it's an umbrella or basket term that incorporates a bunch of other things. I also agree. I think like serverless framework is confusing.
Yeah. So yeah, is it like you brought up cloud? It's the same thing. Like
cloud.com was around back then.
Is the cloud actually a cloud? Like is wireless internet like are there really no wires? There are wires in the router. Like we're just abstracting that away. So that's, I think, where the term kind of got some leverage. But yeah.
And there was a great Twitter post from Werner Vogels where he was like asking for alternatives, and it was this huge long thread. There weren't really any good alternatives suggested there. So if no one came up with a great suggestion there, you know, you lost your chance, and this is the term.
Nice. Well, I've been trying to digest it into just one single slide form. That's what we do at IBM. So the way I see it is you've got under that serverless umbrella, you've got basically a serverless fabric. So there's your first F. You've got the actual event-driven frameworks, the programming model, how you deal. So the fabric deals with the lifecycle of containers, deals with getting services connected and networked and everything. You've got your framework, which is how your actual programming model works. How do you have a standard way that events come in and how you write them back out? And then kind of have a bunch of functions on top that are more domain specific to what you're doing, like bots, IoT, whatever it is, reusable things that you can kind of assemble to make functions. So I'm hoping maybe if we can get a 3F thing going on, right? So fabric.
So we should call it.
Yes.
Just call your company.
Nice.
Nice. I like it.
All right. So so on to section 2, use cases, right? So we've kind of muddied the waters about what it is, but let's talk about what you can do with it. What's really kind of going to be the thing that gets people to start adopting it and proposing new names, right? So when you look at serverless, like where does it fit best? Like what's the best use cases you've seen for it, and kind of what are some amazing use cases you've seen firsthand or maybe built or heard at ServerlessConf, for example?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, man, there's a ton. So we like the most that we see is like data processing and IoT, and then REST APIs, like in that order. And we're talking with like a bunch of enterprise companies that they're adopting this, and they're adopting it like piecemeal, like we were talking about before, because it's a relatively newer technology. Even though Lambda came out like in 2014 or whatever, it's still like, oh, it's this unproven thing. We don't know if we can actually put this, like all of our core business stuff on this until it's proven out. So yeah, a lot of companies are basically adopting it piecemeal. Let's see. I have some examples. There's a company here in San Francisco called Servata. They're doing advertising impressions. So they're like dropping pixels on pages, and they're basically like capturing clickstream data, and they're doing like billions and billions of requests a month, and they're all running that through Lambda. That I found like amazing, because doing that, like setting up all the backend stuff for that would be pretty complex, depending on like how popular your service is. And they're embedding on third-party sites, so they need to basically scale to whatever. I have a bunch of other examples, but I don't want to, hog the mic. But yeah.
Yeah, and we see we're seeing a ton of different use cases as well. I think batch processing in general, where they're either doing the kind of image processing or kind of video metadata editing and transcoding and things like that are definitely like the early use cases that were well understood, mainly just because I think there was a lot of education and user stories around that. And we're starting to see that branch out significantly. Kind of the really cool use cases I've seen are a plethora of startups are starting to do very interesting workloads that just weren't practical before, because it would have just been too cost prohibitive. So doing kind of real-time searches, doing massive parallelized data science applications, very, very cool stuff happening in that space. And I think the kind of full web applications going serverless is still very early, but there's one good use case out there from bustle.com. It's kind of a women's magazine media company. They have millions of users, tens of millions of users, and they kind of were early pioneers of going fully serverless. And they are now fully serverless on their application with billions of invocations per month. So I think they're an early pioneer in that space. For them, they started 12 months ago. At that time, there weren't really good frameworks around. JAWS was around, but it was very early. So they ended up having to build their own framework. So I think you're gonna start seeing more and more of these use cases emerge, just because the tools like serverless framework have matured, and just give them 6 months to 12 months to actually like migrate from EC2 or whatever VM service they're using over to OpenWhisk, Lambda, whatever. and we're going to start seeing tons of different use cases.
Yeah, I think the first thing that I usually see is companies go what I call serverless light, which is everything that is an obvious event source in their infrastructure is what they'll start with. And so they'll have maybe a rescue server, or they'll have a server in their infrastructure or a group of servers that run cron jobs to like clean up old records or send out things that users have scheduled and things like that. So those things are all very obviously a record that, or an event that has an obvious action that needs to be taken that's very short. And so that's how I see them start. But then they find other things in their infrastructure where they're like, well, so these few endpoints are really expensive, but also really spiky. So if we can just move a few endpoints in, then we can actually reduce our existing server fleet by a lot, because these endpoints are taking up the majority of our time, and they're the spikiest ones. So they're the ones that we have the most dead capacity around to support. And I think that that's not, restricted to any industry vertical or really application type, but I think that no matter what company you're in, you've got some events that just fit really well, and those are going to be the ones that over the next, I would say, year to 2 years, you're going to see become a lot more common. And then you're going to see the very earliest of adopters like Bustle continue to make bigger and bigger things on just serverless, whether that's function as a service or through like third-party platforms.
Yeah. Another really good example is A Cloud Guru, the guys that put on Serverless Conf, like their entire pipeline, and they have all this stuff diagrammed out where it's like, okay, so it's like an educational platform for those not familiar. You go watch videos like lynda.com or whatever. But so their authors like upload a video that goes through a processing pipeline that transforms it into like, oh, there's a mobile version of the video, desktop version, all these different resolutions. Then, they put that back into a Dynamo table. They're also using Firebase to basically pipe out like real-time updates to the UI. It's like, it's pretty impressive what they're doing with kind of like a serverless setup. Not necessarily like enterprise-based, but it's really cool in terms of just like a smaller size company as well.
Yeah, I have a course on there. It's actually awesome because all of the things that they have to run are really low, kind of lightweight. And because when you're going on to one of these education sites, you go to the listing, you find your video, or you find your group of videos that you're going to watch, and then you sit down and watch them. And all of that's being offloaded to the CDN. So the things that they're having to do in like a Lambda or in Firebase is really, really lightweight compared to just what they have to pay to deliver, what they have to do to deliver the video, which is outsourced entirely because CDNs have been around forever and have just gotten really good at delivering fat video files in whatever aspect ratio or device size you need.
Yeah.
So they have a really, really well-suited setup.
Yeah, and the cool thing about that is like they are passing that cost like savings on to the like user. So like buying a course on there is cheaper than everywhere else because they're like not paying as much. Another good example of that is moonmail.io. It's kind of like a serverless mailing client, but it's like if you're using that, it's like way cheaper than using like Mandrill.
MailChimp.
Yeah, exactly. Or they have a hosted solution that's just like way, way cheaper. So I think like my prediction is we're going to see a lot more kind of companies like that are just like leveraging this like cheaper infrastructure setup to like, basically do a better, faster, name SaaS XYZ, which should be interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the common thread I'm seeing is like you have non-HTTP workloads, like traditionally beyond infrastructure as a service with PaaS and the other things is it was always focused on microservices as REST APIs. I definitely see a lot more use cases happening from IoT, from bots, from mobile backends, build pipelines, things that want to use all the benefits of cloud, the cost and the on-demand nature, and yet they didn't have that before. But the event-driven programming model is very useful for what they do. And one of the great use cases in the past we've worked with last year, in the past, in the Cloud Pass. We worked with Electronic Arts. They're a mobile game studio based in Melbourne, Australia. They have great games like Need for Speed, Real Racing, The Sims Lite. And so they want to focus on developing their video games, the front end, the real cool experience, and not necessarily worry too much about when that game becomes popular, what they have to do on the back end to scale it, right? And they always know that when they release a game, and they have to do that every 10 days to keep user numbers up, they're on the same curve, right? First 10 days like this, and then tail off. So they know that curve, but they don't know the magnitude of that curve. It could be 1 million users, could be 10,000 users, depending on the successful game. In either case, they don't want to have to build a whole bunch of infrastructure in advance. They want that to auto-scale in the same way for all their game titles, regardless of how successful they are. So I really think mobile is clearly going to be a driver, but especially gaming or any sort of popular, bursty, temporary thing that may happen.
Yeah. And just on the Moonmail subject, what's interesting is they're not even software as a service, because you can get the entire product and just run their CloudFormation template on AWS, and you have your own instance of exactly the same thing that they run.
Interesting.
And so you're getting all of the automation for their platform. So you could actually also run a business selling Moonmail, which is kind of weird, because usually companies that have like an open source, open source stuff,
there's something proprietary. I can't remember what it is, but
I set it up on my account. Like, you want to buy some from me?
Interesting.
I can sell you some emails.
Yeah.
Then it just comes down to who's marketing better.
Yeah. But like, if you look at kind of another case study, which would be GitHub, they have a bunch of open source stuff for running public Git things, but the whole web UI is closed.
Yeah.
So you couldn't sell GitHub using the software that they've published.
Right.
And so we need like a new word for both software as a service, but also runnable yourself as a service.
RAS.
Yeah. We'll work on it.
Nice. All right.
But that's just a really cool delivery model.
Nice. So let's flip it on its head, that question. So great use cases. What about things that are just not a good fit, that either there've been like public flameouts on just trying to use it for the wrong job, or just in general workloads you think are not going to work?
I think in general, there's a few different boxes that you look for if you're trying to rule out serverless applications. And I think those are latency. If you're looking for very low latency, sensitive workloads, it may not be the right use case for you. Maybe parts of it could be, but if it's the user interactive stuff, maybe not. And I think generally, if you have a flat line of traffic that you can easily predict, then it's going to end up being a lot more expensive to run that on serverless. Rather, if you have a spiky traffic, it's going to be a lot less expensive. So those are kind of the main two things that users should look at when deciding what to do with serverless. But in general, a lot of workloads, I think, are a great fit for serverless. It's just a matter of understanding how to build your application in that manner. There may not be a lot of documentation or use cases that are out there. So there needs to be a lot more of those users kind of telling how they built their applications and helping others so that they can do the same thing.
Yeah. And I'd add to that is there's a very specific kind of parallelism that is really awful from a price perspective on serverless. So if you have a case where, let's say you're writing a web scraper and you rely on a lot of third-party things in your application, because each function invocation might only be handling one of those, you take advantage of something like the JavaScript event loop or something in Python like Twisted to interleave a ton of network I/O on a single machine. So if you're doing several hundred millisecond HTTP calls, and normally if you were on just your own machine and you had a scraper running in one event loop that was sharing the network interface, you could do a way larger number per dollar of these requests where you're waiting for a long time, because you're paying for the CPU to juggle 200 of these, versus in serverless, you're paying for 200 per millisecond meters, basically, of billing. And so that specific kind of parallelism can be cost prohibitive, depending on what your value per user is and depending on a couple other things. But if you have that specific kind of parallelism, like check your costs first.
Yeah, for sure. And then the other one I'd add is just like if you're trying to run anything like longer than 5 minutes, that's kind of like a current limitation. However, we are seeing people do that. They're like saving the state and then like triggering another function. I haven't done that personally. It sounds kind of painful, but
that's pretty hacky. Like,
yeah.
But if you're running like, I think if you're running like an OpenWhisk,
OpenWhisk is just containers.
Yeah, then it might be fine, right? So I think there are cases where it could work.
Yeah.
But then you gotta start asking yourself, you know, if I need to run like for 10 minutes or 20 minutes, like why?
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the examples I saw of a workload that was too long is it was some big data processing example. And if you've got super long running giant big data jobs, maybe Hadoop is your thing. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are some things that just have a better solution already that unless the technology radically changes or gets better at something specific, isn't going to make sense to migrate. That's another thing is consider how your costs to migrate versus the advantage of running in serverless is going to look.
Right.
So
there's definitely a change in the programming model that you have to consider. Is it worth your time, your developer's time to skill up on a new approach?
Yeah, exactly.
And
if you're going to save 10% on your infra costs, but it's going to take 3 months away from feature development, that might not be worth it.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think I hear the big data one. I kind of see it as it could be either or, right? Good use case or bad use case. Depends, I think, like you said, it's the interaction. With serverless, you're tying together a lot of different event sources and a lot of different services. So your data locality, your latency, of course, are important. But if there's a way that you might approach the problem differently to split out those jobs into things that run in quicker, smaller segments efficiently, big data analytics could be a good fit for this, but it's not there right now.
Yeah, you have to turn your big data into smaller data.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Okay, so on to segment 3. So the developer experience. So, kind of building on that, I think there's the developer question, right? You can see all these benefits of cost, auto scale, and all the benefits of 12 factors that a serverless framework, that a serverless platform might give you. But what's it going to take to really win developers over, to get them to jump that hurdle, to invest the time, skill up, and learn a new service? What needs to happen?
That is a good question, and that is something that we are like insanely focused on, specifically like building the framework in such a way where, like, just like jumping into the serverless world. There's a lot of things you need to do in every provider's console still, and you kind of have to understand like the Amazon ecosystem or the IBM ecosystem. Like, there's a lot of stuff to grok when coming to this model, especially for a lot of developers out there that haven't really dealt with any DevOps. So we're trying to work on ways to kind of streamline that and abstract away certain things that don't necessarily need to be exposed up front, not necessarily taking those away, because we do have a ton of power users as well. But there's just huge market of developers that could benefit by building things in a serverless way. So that's kind of one of the things that we're focused on, like, really heavily. And we got some stuff coming out pretty soon to try to answer that. But yeah. And then there's a bunch of issues right now that serverless architectures, like just working locally with serverless functions stuff that we're seeing as pain points. And we can jump into those in a little bit, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think without things like frameworks like serverless framework, getting on board with serverless in the first place is extremely challenging. So I think, because these frameworks exist, it's definitely helping to get a lot more adoption, because it's becoming incredibly simple to do, a hello world or basic application and get started really quickly understanding how everything kind of fits together. I think as you get more complex and you're starting to do more serious development, then there definitely is a need for more tools around that, right? A lot of the times the existing tools just don't work in a serverless world. This is kind of precisely why we started IOpipe, is to basically provide better visibility to both the developers and the operators, because you can't take those tools like monitoring tools and they just don't really work properly. They don't have the right kind of resolution. They're not real time enough, and they're not built with serverless architectures in mind. So I think that there needs to be a lot more options for these tools. It's still extremely early days. And I'm hoping that over the next 12 months to 18 months that there are a bunch of new startups emerging, creating a bunch of tools, creating a thriving ecosystem for developers. So I think without those, it's going to be very difficult to get serious adoption from the larger enterprises, right? Enterprises right now are doing like the cron jobs and kind of DevOps and very basic stuff that are non-critical, but getting them to go kind of all in with serverless is going to take a mature ecosystem of tooling.
Yeah, and it's not like you're allowed to install agents either, right?
Right.
Yeah, like one of the biggest things that we get all the time is like, so like the local like integration testing story, like how do you actually test this stuff? And it's actually really, really complex to do that, because you probably are relying on services in the cloud, so mocking those locally isn't a trivial task. But yeah, we actually just had a release, I think it was 3 days ago, where we added local testing back in. I don't think it's, you can't locally integrate, like do integration tests with everything right now. It's very bare bones, but that's one of the biggest pain points that we hear is like, okay, great. How do I test this? And it's like, I mean, right now the answer is really like, you deploy it and test it, which most developers don't want to hear, unfortunately. But
yeah, you lose the benefits of just the black box if you have to install it locally yourself. Like you still want to just focus on the functions. So yeah, there's a good question there. But no, I
tend to fall back on the language tools really heavily. So whatever your language has in terms of testing, make really heavy use of that and pretend like the cloud provider stuff just works,
right,
and then monitor. So monitoring for making sure that things are actually working out in the wild, but local testing to make sure that you're not breaking stuff while you're developing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's really about following like best practices when you're actually writing your functions, splitting up the logic into like unit testable chunks. But yeah, like you said, just like trust that the cloud works, because or you have to do it manually. Which is,
I mean, you can write tester things like Gappy is a Python tool that lets you just write out tests for REST APIs.
Yeah.
You have those, but that means that you have to deploy all the way. And so usually that's something that would just happen before you deploy to prod, that you deploy into like a staging.
Yeah.
So we have integration tests set up for the framework. Man, it's like a huge suite. It's a lot of stuff. And the framework team is like,
well, that's good to know.
It's a lot of work to maintain that stuff, but important.
Yeah, and I think like local testing versus testing in the cloud is like such a huge debate, anyways, because the various cloud providers all have different stories there, right? Like Amazon says you have to test in the cloud, you can't test locally, and Google says the opposite, and I don't know what IBM says. So it's very fascinating, all of these differing opinions.
Microsoft is on that test locally.
Yeah, so it's very interesting, but it's super hard to test locally when you're using all these backend as a service, right? It's just hard to stub everything.
Yeah, I think this is why we definitely need something like the serverless framework, like Zappa for Python applications, like Lambada for Java, right? Giving the developer the same experience that they had writing, the Django, their Flask apps, their Node.js applications with the tools on their desktop that they're familiar with, just knowing that they have to, implement a certain interface when they actually deploy that function. But if they're able to use these shims above, function as a service providers, At least it gives them a bridge to start using the testing tools and local tools they have, plus have a familiar programming model, and use that as a way to understand, get the business benefits out of functions as a service before they then move to step 2, which is pure functions as a service, where hopefully there's better tooling in terms of monitoring and testing at that point, maybe a year on.
Well, and in those other frameworks, in the your traditional web frameworks like your Django's and your Rails's of the world, you don't have your framework isn't doing your testing for you. You have RSpec or something else that's doing all of the testing that's separate from your web framework. And I think that in serverless, it's going to be the same thing. You're going to have what your language provides for testing that you use, and then you're going to deploy and manage your deployment using serverless or Zappa or Chalice or on and on and on.
Yeah, for sure.
And that means you guys don't have to write test tools. So like, good for you.
All right, I'll let our CTO Flo know. No more tests.
Nice. But yeah, in general, I think what we're looking for here is kind of like that Google Maps moment. Like it took, like Ajax as a technology was out there, the bits and pieces were there, but nobody quite knew how to use them in such a way to make a 10x impact until Google Maps came out, showed somebody, hey, listen, this is what you can do with technology. And developers then said, wow, that's an awesome end result. Let me dig into how they did that. And then find out, okay, I'm willing to make the jump into program this new way because I know there's an awesome user experience that I can suddenly get out of that. Hopefully, maybe that's, a couple of ISVs that come out, they do IDEs in the cloud, for example, that help you, do whatever 10 times better, 10 times cheaper by backing an IDE with a serverless framework that can compile your code in a function, give you an output, whether that syntax worked or not, does lint on the cloud, something like that. We just need that Google Maps moment. Somebody has to just show an awesome app. I think there's some starting to be out there, but we need one really developer focused that says this is what you can do for your customers by adopting serverless now.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Awesome.
I think another challenge, just throw out there, and I think we touched on this briefly, is like, so the other challenge is like keeping the mental model of like now, if you're doing things in a microservice, approach, you're breaking things down. So your system gets a little bit more complex to keep in your head. Now we're breaking it down even further into like individual functions. So like, how do you keep that mental model or like that visualization of like, what is this service doing? What does it look like? What are the different pieces and resources that it's using? That, at least to me, starting out with like serverless stuff was like a huge challenge of like, it's easy when you have like a service with 3 functions with one, database. But now if you have like 4 services or 5 services with, each one has 4 functions and, on and on and on. So I think we're going to start to see a lot of stuff coming out to kind of answer that, or at least I hope.
And so is the hard part just that you have all of these different services and understanding the relations between them, or is it also things inside the service? So if I've got 4 functions in a service.
It's really like both. Like, so how do they tie together? Especially if things are triggered. It's event based, right? So this service triggers this service that triggers this, and that might put it into 3 kinesis streams or whatever. Like the things can get kind of complex pretty fast. And to me, keeping a manual diagram of that, I don't want to do. I want it to be automated. So I want something like that. Basically, is what
it's coming.
Yeah. Yeah.
Awesome. So on that note, looking forward 1 year from now, what's going to be different? Do we finally have a name? Do we finally have a model? Do we have some awesome Google Maps moment? What do you guys think?
I think we're stuck with the name.
Like it or not.
Yeah.
I think that in a year's time, the ecosystem is going to grow tremendously. There will be a lot more tools and frameworks and all kinds of different use cases that emerge. And it's going to make it a lot easier for people to start adopting. I suspect that, the larger enterprises will start, looking at, they're already starting to look at serverless, but I think they'll start, dipping their toe in the water and getting a little bit deeper in terms of going down that path of serverless as things mature, as they get a lot more of their peers who are having success as well. I'm not sure if there'll be a Google Maps moment. It's hard to predict, obviously, but it's also hard to like visualize it because serverless is a way of writing applications, and it's not necessarily obvious if the application is serverless or not. But there could be some crazy use case that emerges that's just impossible any other way. So that'd be really interesting to see.
Yeah. Yeah, I think more and more greenfield projects will become like entirely serverless because that's kind of one of the easiest ways to ramp up. So I think that we'll see more and more of that. And then the other thing that I'm like pretty excited about is this concept of multi-cloud like serverless architecture. So you're not necessarily tied down to a specific provider. Let's say we have a bunch of stuff in Amazon, but we also want to leverage like the Google like image API or the Google voice recognition API or whatever. Like we're going to start to see kind of like a mashup of all these things. And I think that'll be really cool and really freeing to developers to like really like, yeah, get out of this idea like, oh, we're in Amazon, so we have to use all Amazon things. We're in Google, we're in IBM. Like there's a lot of stuff out there and each kind of provider, they have some core competencies about them that I would like to leverage in different applications. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm hoping, like you said, there's definitely integrations. I mean, APIs, maybe things get more efficient. We'll have hopefully some killer use cases. I know they're starting to emerge, but I'm still looking for that awesome thing that's going to be that helps us transcend the naming and say, hey, listen, when we're talking about serverless architectures and the benefits, that's the thing we can go point to. So I'm sure that's going to come out. I keep looking at conference announcements too. I'm like, just like with containers and Docker, right? So everybody put a talk in there that mentioned, one of those two words. They got accepted, regardless of what the conference was.
We just put them all in one conference instead. We just concentrate on all of them.
Yeah. That's why we have serverless conf. But I think there's going to be some interesting stuff coming out, and I think the integrations are definitely going to happen too. Like you said, multi-cloud between providers, but also different models. Running this on top of OpenStack, on top of Cloud Foundry, on top of whatever else. Definitely integrations of seeing how OpenWhisk or something else can run in different models, the different things that they can consume. I think that's something that's definitely going to show up. Always the integration story seems to follow the emerging technology.
What do you see for OpenStack? Do you see them actually trying to like rewrite Mistral to be a function as a service, or do you think they'll adopt like OpenWhisk's sort of?
Yeah.
Do you have any idea?
Yeah. So my colleague actually, he wrote a way to do the distributed OpenWhisk components on top of OpenStack. He provided some Ansible cookbooks for that. But what I could see in terms of OpenWhisk and OpenStack is I think OpenStack has learned that they need to do their core competencies well, the compute, the network, and storage, and just provide the framework for the additional thing on top. So if you take their approach to containers, right, they started with no Docker driver. Eric Windish, he worked on that. He treated a container as just another type of compute, when in fact there was so much more innovation going on with containers and best practices towards orchestration, towards clusters, that you then saw the emergence of the heap pattern, the Magnum project, and now the Zun project, right? They're realizing that they can't just innovate on their side to match the innovation on the container side with the serverless side. They just need to provide the APIs that are providing consistent compute network and storage services. And just as long as there's integration, providing those APIs, things can coexist and things can evolve independently at different speeds. Okay. Any other closing thoughts or other questions you guys have for this group?
I don't know.
Look for more open source projects around serverless.
Yeah.
Because that seems to be the way that kind of the table stakes for a lot of things. Like pretty much OpenWhisk, obviously open source. Even Microsoft's implementation's open source. And so I think that there's going to be a trend there for, even if the providers aren't open source runtimes entirely, but I think that a lot of the tools above are going to be open source.
Nice.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I think that's one of the great things about the OpenWhisk packaging model, right? It's not perfect, and we're working on a better definition for it, but being able to at least, because there's the core, the fabric I said, still needs the frameworks and the functions on top. You need to have packages that are open source that people can reuse, even across different providers, not just OpenWhisk. But I think the ecosystem of things around all of these platforms, be it Lambda, be it Google Functions, be it Microsoft, is going to need a whole ecosystem of just functionality, shims, APIs, whatever it is. That's certainly going to have to all be based on open source.
That's cool. Yeah, have you given that presentation anywhere I could check out?
Which one, on packages?
Just the different layers that you're talking about? Yeah.
No. We've been working on kind of a developer works article on it. So we're kind of kicking around the ideas. I like the 3 Fs, so I'll try to put it out there. I'll put it in a little diagram. Maybe I'll post it, as a comment to this YouTube video when we record it.
Yeah, because we definitely want to, support all the different providers out there. So we should definitely, yeah.
Awesome. Cool. All right. Anybody else? All right. Well, thank you, Adam. Thank you, David. Thank you, Ryan. I really appreciate you guys joining me on a Friday afternoon. And this should be available right on top of YouTube pretty soon. Thanks again.
Nice. Yeah, thanks for having me, man. It was good. It was good to chat about serverless stuff. I would do this every day, to be honest. So.
Yeah. Well, this whole Feast Around series, we're trying to make a series out of it. So whether it's me hosting or someone else from the team, we'd like to have you back, have a follow-on conversation, and see if our yearly predictions came true.
Oh no! Don't hold us to those. Anything but.
But we'll definitely want to have follow-on conversations. I mean, this place is moving so fast, so we'll definitely need them.
Great.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks everyone.
Have a good day.
Later.